Well, some insight into our next segment now. It's been titled Watching the Civic Space. And if I were just to give context to that, reading from a particular website which monitors civic space. They say civic space is the bedrock of any open and democratic society. When a civic space is open, citizens and civil society organizations are able to organize, participate, and communicate without hindrance. Now, has there been any hindrance or obstacles in the last couple of months, years, I don't know, to shed light on why it is important to keep tabs on what is happening in the civic space? And there has been a lot of talk in recent times. Don't forget that we've had a constitutional, there's a constitutional amendment process currently ongoing. There have been attempts to amend the Electoral Act. That is still ongoing as well. There have been talks around the media. We saw a protest about 2-3 weeks ago on the front pages of the dailies. There's also been a lot of talk around the directive recently issued to the broadcast organizations in Nigeria from the regulator about how newspaper headlines should be reviewed. There have been those kinds of conversations. So why is it important to continue to keep tabs on our civic space? We have with us this morning Reverend Father Barkindo, who is the Executive Director of the Cooker Center. Father, you're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Thank you so much, Malco, for having me.
Well, pretty interesting times we're in right now, and I'm sure that quite a lot has been going on in the civic space. In your own opinion, would you say that our civic space is expanding? Are citizens more aware of their duties as citizens and even better aware of how better to influence policies in their own favor?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Increasingly, Nigerians are fully becoming aware of their rights, they're expressing themselves. But of course, among Nigerians too, there are two narratives that are currently existing. One is people who feel very strongly that the civic space is shrinking because of some of the issues you have mentioned, the banning of Twitter, you know, the NSAS protests and the way it was suppressed, and with all these bills coming out in terms of the media. But there are other people who actually argue that it is thriving. Nigerians are having conversations on a daily basis, in the markets, in the cars, on the plane, under the tree, everywhere they go, and that anywhere you meet a Nigerian, they have an opinion on its politics and the way the country is actually governed. And this is even amplified with the presence of the social media, where we talk, we interrogate. But probably what has happened is that we are not collectively talking in a strategic and a comprehensive manner. So the intellectual component that should accompany governance is actually missing. You can talk, but how are these views and opinions collated and designed into a comprehensive policy statement that can actually support the government? And I think that for me, this is where it is slightly lacking. Because I think you don't actually have to go to school. If a particular government policy is affecting you and your family, as we say in Nigeria, hunger will make you discover your talent. I think people have opinions on how things should be. And some of these opinions, I think, should be collated in a comprehensive and a strategic manner that can support governance. We don't actually have to insult each other.
In your own opinion, I'm wondering, would you say, because you have tried to balance the two sides in terms of those who say it is shrinking and those who say, well, we're talking more. Have there been any recent instances where citizens have been able to organize to influence policies that could affect them, either positively or negatively?
Absolutely. I was part of the Cooker Center and myself. We were part of the drive, particularly for example, the electronic transmission of results. I know how organizations like PLAC, Iaga, Not Too Young to Wrong, the Kuka Center, with so many support from other people. We kept pushing and going to the National Assembly. And I think eventually there were delays, and that was why you see the passage of that bill had the kind of controversy that at the end of the day it had. Because a lot of citizens were following, they were aware, they were reading the bills, they were literally interrogating, making phone calls, back channel negotiations and all that. But ultimately, it's not every Nigerian citizen that has this opportunity, has the opportunity to have access to those who are in power, to those who are policymakers. It's very few people. And you really have to know where the buttons are that you can actually press. So what happens to the views of millions of other Nigerians who are actually affected by some of these policies? How can we bring some of these views, to the fore? So in my own personal opinion, I think that it is shrinking at different levels. At serious policy levels where we have access to government and we can talk, I think there's a bit of serious opposition probably from the government. But for ordinary people, they're expressing their views, because for those who are in power, maybe those views don't matter anyway, because those ordinary people may not have that strength to directly, confront them, to directly be in their face. So I think that it depends on how you look at it.
It's a very interesting distinction that you make in terms of the different spaces that exist. That in terms of having daily conversations, and I think that distinction is extremely important. In terms of having daily conversations, Nigerians are talking amongst themselves, and it would seem there is no hindrance to that, is there? But in terms of having the space for influence in terms of politics and policies, it would seem that is the space that is shrinking.
Absolutely,
so
it is.
I'm just reiterating what I heard you say, and I think that distinction is extremely important. The NSAS protest, which we saw last year, when you saw that protest, as someone who's participated very actively in the civil society, what came to your mind?
Actually, when the protest was going on, I was in Gombe. We were implementing a project at Operation Safe Corridor. Interestingly, the perception in the north, in most parts of the north, local community, among young people, was completely different from what you see in the south. For northerners, these NSAS young people, for most of the young people in the north, they are like, these guys are scammers, Yahoo boys, drug dealers. They are simply in opposition to the government. But that is not the case in the south. So you do not have this united front that should exist in terms of understanding what is the common good, what are we actually fighting for. And I think one of the points I need to make is that probably within our capacity to deploy the civic space is that one of the biggest challenges you see, we are affected by the issues of fake news, lack of evidence, research, and data. So people engage within the civic space on the basis of sentiments, sometimes a bit of prejudice, a bit of misinformation, misrepresentation. So how do we get facts and evidence that can guide the engagement of ordinary people? Because there's lots of misinformation out there, and people can simply pick up a piece of news on Facebook, for example, without interrogation, without critical analysis. They begin to engage without having the facts in their hands. And I think that is a challenge, especially among ordinary people that don't have the sphere of influence. And there are all kinds of fake news that litter around. And I think it's a challenge. And I think that affected the NSAS protest. That's why you saw the division that you have seen.
I'm looking at, the disparity which you just mentioned, and indeed it was not difficult to see when we saw NSAS protests in Lagos and in some other parts of the country, and we saw, oh no, we want SARS protests in certain parts of the country as well. There were huge questions, and I think that you have underlined what the major problem is: the common good. What is the common good? And I sometimes people will say that is what the leadership should be able to find, the common denominator. But it would seem that what we have seen so far is a divide and rule in such a way that it only favors the political class. They understand that sometimes what might favor A might not be in tandem, what B might not really care about, and what B might care about might not really be the problem of A. And sometimes it was seen that they play these differences to their own advantage. Seeing this, first and foremost, how can citizens begin to find underlying things which will, be their unifying factor, if you like, their common denominator, that will be the minimum, will spell good for A and will also spell good for B, when you look at how divided it would seem we are along so many lines?
I think if you look at existing political theories, there is a fundamental distinction between state building and nation building. The state building is the physical infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, and all that. Nation building is about managing our diversity, managing our differences, and living together without mutual suspicion. And I think that is really where the challenge has lied. And I think for me, managing our diversity should also be seen as a common good, because it is absolutely so important. If we do not address that, then the divide and rule that you mentioned will actually become a problem. When there's poverty, when there's sickness, when there's hunger, they don't know tribe, no religion. We can all become victims. And that is why good governance should make the common good an essential ingredient. And at the moment in Nigeria, managing our diversity, I think to me should be a common good. And we have not actually handled that properly.
Let me quickly take this to my colleague now. I understand that he has questions for you, as well as going to introduce our next guest, Ayo.
Well, it would seem like we looked into the same crystal ball, Malkwe, because I was going to ask just the same question you asked. Maybe they'll use different words, because if we do not have a unifying factor on the side of A and on the side of B, that will always be an issue. But so you've answered that to an extent, Father Barkindo, but let me bring in our next guest now. He is Ahmed Suleiman, a rights activist and lecturer of international humanitarian law at ABU Zaria. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, let me ask you, do you think that the civic space is widening or is being stifled?
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
I think the issue is not the shrinking of the civil space.
Your TV set so that we can hear you better, or just mute it so that, yes. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. I think the question needs to be rephrased. The question should be reframed like this. Our civic space, are they rising up to the responsibility? The issue to me, as it appears, is not an issue of deepening civil space, but an issue of civil space not rising to the demanded responsibility of civil space. For instance, Nigeria is passing through a stage. We need a civil space that understands the trends and bring in capacity, the activity that fits the required gap. Like the previous speaker stated, there are two things involved: nation building and state building. Nigeria is passing through nation building, but our civic space, instead of concentrating on nation building, they are rather defining and overemphasizing our diversity, which is even creating more problems on ground. And believe me, this is a very serious trend. If you take the part that Somalia, India, Sudan have taken, the civil space is leading us to a dangerous trend. Libya took this way, and the end result was catastrophic. So we need a civil space that understands the trend. For instance, I've been an active player in civil space. I led the Occupy Kano movement in Kano, where we occupied Kano line. But later I came to realize that most of these disruptive activities do not build a nation. And that is why, for instance, me as a person, I mature up to what I call redefining civil space, redefining activism. So our civic space need to redefine activism. So that instead of always emphasizing on what divides us, let us emphasize on growing up, strengthening our weakness. How much are we focusing on bringing local government to play its active role? How much more are we checking our state government to rise up to the demanded expectations?
Well, you have raised critical issues that I think, will definitely need further examination, because there are a number of issues kept coming to my mind as you were speaking, but we'll take them on when we return from this break. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Reverend Father Barkindo, as well as Suleiman, are still our guests, and we're talking about the civic space. So let me come back to you, Mr. Suleiman. On the back of what Father Barkindo said the other time about the different reactions to, during the, NSAS protests and all of that, when one side is saying we want it, one side is saying no, we want SARS to remain. And he also talked about the common good. Do you think that in watching the civic space, we have a mutual understanding of what is common good as a nation?
Yes. To have a common good, you need a balance. You need a proactive civil space that is proactive in terms of pushing us to progress, but also watchful in terms of the hazard. Now, the problem with civic space in Nigeria and activists is that, meanwhile, they push for what they think is progressive. Most of us are not aware of the hazards we are pushing the country into. And seriously, from my background, from my experience as an activist, I came to learn that this is a serious lapse. And as a lawyer, as an academic, I've studied a lot of countries that tend to manage this balance. And believe me, the end result of this error is catastrophic. Take Libya, for instance. Activists in Libya wanted progress. They pushed for progress. At the end of the day, they disrupted what the system they have. And the situation they are now is worse. Now, take for instance, Somalia. So Nigeria is in this situation where we need to have a proactive civil space, but should be responsible, not a civil space that try to ignite our diversities. Take the recent issues with Sahara and all that. Instead of bringing the country united, most readers now are rather touched by the sensitivity of what they publish. Take some of the comments by some people that push for either self-determination and all that. At the end of the day, they end up injuring other people. So we need to come down. The common good means, where should Nigeria be? What happened to our security? I'm so happy that the last program you had ended with a comment. They say, unless we improve our capacities, there will be no progress. And I want to add to that unless we maintain our security, there will be no improvement in capacity. So civil space must be mindful of this very tight balance. And the problem with Nigeria is that if you take most of our activists, you'll find out that they are erring on the side of hazard and danger to our stability, to our security, and to our unison as a country.
It leads me back to the same question, Mr. Suleiman. By the way, could you kindly turn down the volume on that TV set, because it's still howling back and we are unable to really enjoy the wonderful things that you're saying. But if you also recall, I'm on the website, for instance, of the United Nations Human Rights Office, and in defining the civic space, one of the elements, crucial elements at that, is, excuse me, engaging in dialogue. And I ask that against, that same question of whether or not we have a mutual understanding. Do you think on all sides of the divide, among all practitioners of the civic space, all those who are active in the civic space, do you think we've been able to have that engagement, that conversation, to define mutually what is the common good for Nigeria? You have talked about that it as well, that we need a common good that is for Nigeria. Do you think we have a mutual understanding, given all the diversity that we have, you know, as a nation, all within the same pot, so to speak?
Yes, we have a problem there. There are two basic problems. The first problem is that popular opinion in Nigeria, the rate of literacy is very low. A lot of people are not very exposed. Secondly, even the activists, some of our activists are yet to mature up to the level where their activities can play an influence. And let me refer to an experience here. Formerly, over a decade ago, I've been engaged in this disruptive activism. But when I redefine activism, I came to see that my impact is more fruitful. For instance, there are a lot of policies in this government that have come together with some NGOs, and we've been able to redirect the policy. Take for instance, there was a crisis between CAN and federal government about this CAC. Some of us saw that right now Nigeria do not need these kind of diversities and problems. We came together, me and Senator Ita Enang, we moderated, we mediated, we started with the federal government, we started with CAN, we tried to take the concern of SAN, we took the concern of federal government, and we came with a mediatory role. So this is what I'm saying about activism. Activism is about defining what a country needs to move ahead, coming together, do it without the need to impress anybody by disrupting the country. But if you are rather taken away by international pressure, then you have a problem. We need to learn from the lesson of Professor Lee. He said countries and nations need to think internationally but act locally. If you look at all countries that have tried to redefine their interests according to their specific needs and mindful of their specific threats have moved ahead. There are a lot of countries I can cite a lot of them, like Rwanda, for instance, you said. Rwanda passed through a serious crisis and they came to realize that diversities and all that is not their problem. So they focus on progress and play down all negative and divisive tendencies. Rwanda is moving ahead now in Africa. Now, if you take countries
just one moment, Mr. Suleiman. You raised a crucial issue that's been on my mind that I just wanted you to land. So let's just go there. Do you think our diversity could be a problem in one way or another? Do you think our sentiments, ethnic sentiments, religious sentiments, political sentiments, do you think they play a role in the civic space? Do you think it affects the way the civil society organizations in the various parts of the country lead the people in this democracy?
Seriously, it's playing a very terrible and negative role. These are diversities. And we need educated ones among us to lead our people towards collective interest, that is national interest, and play down more on our diversities. Because our diversities will bring us down. The issue is like this. You have what is called centripetal and centrifugal forces. Now, to build a nation, you have to manage these forces. But in Nigeria, these competing diversities are now pushing the centripetal forces so far that the whole nation is tilting towards a 12 states. And that is why you have a problem with the central government in this situation, that we want to bring all possible force to keep the country together. Now, some countries have been able to survive this. Some countries survived it. Some countries couldn't. Countries like South Africa survived it. Nelson Mandela provided a leadership where his focus was not about revenge or anything. His focus was about South Africa as a nation. Now, other countries like India, when they started, they couldn't manage. Mahatma Gandhi wanted a national collective interest. But they couldn't manage, it broke down into Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, if you take Sudan, they couldn't manage, they broke down. And I'm telling you, if you take a statistics of all these countries that are broken down, their situation is far worse than what it would have been.
We seem to be
Pakistan and India have the diversity they would.
All right. Well, Mr. Suleiman, the issues are not just going to go away unless we do the needful. But let me quickly, just one moment, let me take this to Reverend Father Barkindo. Father Barkindo, it would seem like if we are going to take this issue up and deal with this as we should, then the conversation of a common good on all sides of the divide will have to start with the civil society organizations that lead in the civic space. You remember the Vice President is one of those who have said that we are seriously divided against, in our fault lines. We have very, very serious fundamental fault line issues. And in talking about this, in watching the civic space, it would seem like the CEOs need to begin the dialogue among themselves and then take this one message of a common good all over the nation. How do you propose that we do that, if you agree?
In my opinion, the civic space is not a human person. It's a collection of different voices, and ultimately is a reflection of what this country is. So the common good for me is also our common citizenship, our common identity. And over time, Nigeria has failed to mold a common identity for all of us, to an extent that where to be a Nigerian is more important than your tribe and your religion. And that has to be reflected in our rules, in our constitution, in all the regulations that surround us. And it's very difficult to have the common good and to have a collective voice, either within the country, either within the civil society, if over years a country is governed on the basis of inequality, marginalization, and exclusion. And I think that has been our biggest challenge. So it's very difficult to cultivate a common citizenship when there are issues of inequality, injustice, marginalization, and exclusion. A lot of people live on the fringe. They are not being heard. Their voices are not recognized. And that's why everyone has withdrawn into the womb of their religion, of their ethnicity. Because to get admission, even in a hospital, I probably need to speak a certain language. I probably need to know someone that knows someone that knows someone. And so a country that continues on this path is very difficult to really understand even what the common good is. So for me, at the constitutional level, we must cultivate the common citizenship. What does it mean to be a Nigerian? But if we continue to preach where one religion is superior, one ethnic group is superior, different types of laws exist for the citizens, one in the south, one in the north, and where the constitution is not subscribed to by all Nigerians, I think that becomes really a problem. Up to now, we are still fighting. Is Nigeria a secular state? Is it a religious state? How do you even interpret the secularity of the Nigerian state? What does it mean to be a citizen? So for me, if you want to define the common good, there are certain rules and regulations that we also have to follow, particularly the constitution. So we need to define that very properly.
So who do you think should be leading this conversation? I think that's a very key question.
We have all the structures of democracy in place. But I think that for people who are already in power, to protect their positions, to protect their offices, to protect their political careers and their political futures, in so many ways they don't seem to be interested. We, the citizens, must really take this up, particularly the civil societies, and lead the way. And that's what we have been really struggling to do. When you have millions of people already impoverished, living in poverty, in hunger, what a lot of Nigerians are right now thinking about is survival. So to even have this engagement is very difficult. And that's why it is very few Nigerians that have access to those who are in power, to those who have influence. And those numbers, I don't think, are good enough. And one of the biggest issues is just the division within even the civic space. They don't have a common voice to speak on issues that really matter in this country. And I think that is a thing of concern.
I mean, I'd like to go back. I mean, you heard our guest who's joining us via Zoom, and I'm wondering what your own thoughts are with what he talks about in terms of what could happen if the civic space is mismanaged. He gives examples of what has happened in Libya, in Somalia, and he's made these references. What are your thoughts in that regard? Because there are those who will say that the security situation cannot be ignored in terms of, you know, how the civic space is perceived. What are your thoughts with regards to that and where we currently are with our security situation?
Last week I was listening to the Attorney General Malemi, and he spoke about people engaged in the civic space. And whatever you say, whatever your agitations are, should be in the common interest of Nigeria, should add to nation building. But it's always very difficult if these things are happening in the context of injustice, in the context of marginalization. And I understand. But we also have to know that those who are within the civic space are also contributing to see how we can bring security and stability. It's not just that those who are speaking, who are protesting, they simply want to disorganize the country. A lot of people are victims already. Their families are probably being kidnapped. Their children are being with kidnappers. You don't expect them to sit at home and just be quiet. It's absolutely not possible. So when they go onto the streets, they protest. Does that mean they are adding to insecurity? I don't think so. They simply want their voices to be heard. And they want the government up and doing to see what the government can do, you know, in stabilizing the situation.
Let me quickly throw this now to our guest online. Sir, I was going to ask you, what are your thoughts? I mean, you have heard him talk about, you know, the reasons why sometimes people are on the street, why it is that they want to get their voices heard. Would you say, in your own opinion, that government has encouraged a peaceful engagement with government? Because it would seem that oftentimes when we look at the history of agitations in Nigeria and those whose voices have been heard, it would seem that even government selection of which voice to listen to has been has encouraged people to take to the streets, has encouraged some form of violent agitation, such that if you do not become violent, it would seem that you might not get heard. Take a look at some of the agitations we're currently seeing and what we've seen in the past. What are your thoughts on that? It looks like we're having some issues with audio there. We cannot hear you. If you will kindly unmute yourself, and maybe we'll be able to hear you. I don't know if you can hear. Obviously, you can hear us. Let us see if we can rework that. Oh dear, we seem to be having some issues with that audio there. But let me quickly ask you what your thoughts are, because it would seem that somehow government, if people do, you know, if people take to the streets more, it would seem that it's because peaceful channels is that very, very few and far between, or that they rarely exist. Yes, the NSAS protest is a different kettle of fish in that we have now seen some response, especially on the parts, there was some mandate on the part of the federal government asking state governments to set up judicial panels to listen to the grievances of people. But that would never have come about without people taking to the streets in the very first instance. What what channels do you think need to exist for governments to be able to have been able to take on this complaint in the very first instance without people having to take to the streets? And how do you think, I don't want to ask you double barrel question, let's take that on first.
I mean, you are absolutely right. I will go with you. I think over time what has emerged is what we call the political economy of conflict. Right with the Niger Delta militants, we fight, the government settles us, gives us amnesty. Boko Haram emerge. Let us fight, the government settles us, rehabilitates us, sends us back into our communities with startups. We even look better than the victims who have been there and living in IDP camps. So with all these instances, it's very clear that the political economy of protest. So government will only listen to us when sometimes we go physical, when sometimes we... And so the government really has to manage in terms of dialogue, in terms of actually listening. I know if you are in power, different people come to you with all different stories. You have to be critical to select. And that's what we are actually trying to do, like our event today at the Kuka Center. We literally even want to engage university students to begin to teach them on how these civic spaces, on how to engage the government without getting physical, without getting violent. And I think for the government coming down to the level of the people, it will be quite nice to see them talk in a comprehensive and in a strategic manner. That
sort of engagement is extremely important. That sort of education. We know that at some point civics was introduced in secondary schools. I don't know if it's still a course that is studied in secondary schools. But that level of education, because it would seem that a lot of people are learning their rights as citizens, maybe on social media, but are not quite aware of what their duties are supposed to be in a democratic setting.
Absolutely, and you'll be shocked the level of ignorance, even at universities, polytechnics, and schools. And this is the project we have been doing in partnership with the Yaradua Foundation and Global Rights. Literally going to these universities, talking to people, educating them on how to take advantage of the civic space and bring their voices to be heard. You know, sometimes with the government, even if there's a bomb blast, seeing the president, seeing a particular minister, showing compassion and sympathy is also the use of the civic space. I don't want to see the civic space as something only to be deployed by civil society organizations. All of us are citizens, including those who are in power. So for them to come down to the level of the ordinary Nigerian, to engage, that is the use of the civic space. So we need to see that coming forward, and that will de-escalate the situation, because there's so much accumulated grievances amongst ordinary Nigerians, and we need to ventilate that, and the government has to help in doing so.
Let me quickly take this now to our guests who are still online. We couldn't get his audio earlier, but I think that Mr. Ahmad Suleiman is back for us. If you did hear my question earlier with regards to how government itself has encouraged some agitations, what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think that government can begin to show that you do not have to, come take to the streets before whatever it is that you have to say is heard?
I think there are areas we have to give a thumb up to the government. There are areas that one may advise the government to improve upon. The areas that will have to give a thumb up to government is, for instance, this NSAS. When they started, whatever they demanded, government was ready to let them have it. I wish and hope government will continue to remain focused on that. Another instance I can also cite, when there was this pending crisis about Corporate Affairs Commission Act and between CAN and some federal government, when some of our NGO ambassadors for peace, along with Senator Eta and I, we came. Government listened to us. They were ready to let us mediate. We also got the concern of CAN. We went and saw them, and they were ready to listen. And I wish, like the Reverend Father said, government will improve upon this, so that most of these grievances, sometimes all it takes is give a space for it to be ventilated. But on the other side, we should not turn the hands of government to let it be so passive that divisive activities take us to the edge. So it's like I've started in the beginning of my discourse. It is a very tight balance. There is no perfection in it. You have to always maintain an equilibrium. You have to watch out for the balance. Because if you are too soft, it also spells doom. If you are too hard, it spells doom. So you have to do what Obasanjo said, a character and stick. Sometimes you listen, sometimes you keep a firm stand. Obasanjo tried that approach when terrorism started in Plateau and all that. There are times he maintained a fine foot. So I think government should also maintain that, and I see government doing that. I can see government when it comes to activities that trend our net diversity. I can see government very strong on it. I hope government should continue doing that. Whatever threatens, because even our own jurisprudence, Nigerian jurisprudence, if you look at the case of how do you call this guy? Supreme Court have maintained that whenever Dubovo versus Asariba, Dubovo Asari versus the government, Supreme Court have always maintained that whenever there is a threat to security or national unity, government should, all other considerations, including even our freedoms, should take a second place. So government should maintain that balance. As far as I'm concerned, I think there are areas we can score government very high, like some of the instances I've cited. But there are areas that government also needs to improve.
Well, Mr. Suleiman, if you can hear us, somehow your audio is still not very good, but we have to thank you for your submissions on the program this morning. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on how to improve the civic space and make the most of it. Ahmad Suleiman is a rights activist and lecturer at International Humanitarian Law in the ABU Zaria. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.